In the spring of 2021, a retired fur trapper in Price County, Wisconsin contacted this channel with a piece of trail camera footage and a story that he had been carrying for the better part of 33 years. The footage was recent, a few months old, captured on a camera he had mounted to a white pine about 6 miles south of the Flambeau River, deep in the state forest, on a game trail he had been walking since he was a teenager. The camera caught something crossing the trail at night on 2 legs, and when we reviewed the clip, the shape that moved through the infrared frame was large enough and wrong enough in its proportions that the first thing your mind does is try to make it into something familiar. A bear on its hind legs, a tall man in a coat. Anything that fits inside the catalog of things you know exist, but the longer you look at it, the more that effort fails. The shoulders are too wide, the arms hang too low, and the head, visible for just a moment as the shape turns toward the camera before continuing into the timber, has a profile that does not belong on anything that walks upright. Elongated, canine, ears standing erect on the top of the skull. This is a Dogman story, and it is unlike any Dogman encounter we have covered on this channel, because the man who sent us that footage believes he knows exactly where the Dogman came from. He believes it came from him. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from, and if you have had an encounter like this. The man asked us to change his name, and we agreed. We will call him Merle. What Merle told us over the course of several long phone conversations is a story that sits in a category by itself. Every Dogman encounter we have covered follows a recognizable pattern. A witness in a remote setting observes something they cannot explain. They try to rationalize it. They fail. They carry the knowledge forward in silence, and their life bends under something they cannot share. Merle's story has all of those elements, but it has something else, something none of the other accounts have. Merle did not just see a Dogman. In the fall of 1987, on a trapline he had been running along a feeder creek south of the South Fork of the Flambeau River, Merle found what he thought was an abandoned wolf pup in a shallow den. He took it home. He kept it for 3 weeks. And when it became clear that whatever he had pulled out of that den was not a wolf, not a dog, not anything he had a name for, he sold it to a man who ran a roadside animal attraction along Highway 8 east of Prentice. The man put it in a cage. It lived in that cage for almost 10 years, and then it got out. What Merle has been dealing with ever since, what that trail camera footage represents, is something he described to us in a voice so flat and worn it sounded like a man reading his own medical chart. He said the Dogman came back. He said it found him. He said it has been in those woods around his property for the better part of 25 years, and he has spent every one of those years understanding what he did and what it cost. To understand how a man ends up pulling a Dogman pup out of a den in the Wisconsin Northwoods and selling it to a roadside attraction, you have to understand the life Merle was living when it happened. You have to understand Price County. Price County sits in the north-central part of Wisconsin, about 200 miles north of Madison, in country that was logged bare by the turn of the 20th century and has spent the last 100 years growing back. The county covers just under 1,300 square miles. The population, which peaked during the logging era and has been drifting downward ever since, sits around 14,000. The county seat is Phillips, a town of about 1,500 people on the Elk River, built originally as a railroad stop for the Wisconsin Central Railway, and named after the railroad's general manager, a man who likely never spent a winter there. Phillips was destroyed by fire in 1894, rebuilt, and has been gradually shrinking for the last 80 years as the industries that kept it alive, timber and its downstream products, consolidated and mechanized and moved their operations elsewhere. Highway 13 runs north-south through the county, connecting Phillips to the towns of Prentice to the south and Park Falls to the north. Highway 8 runs east-west, cutting through the southern part of the county through Prentice and Catawba. The Flambeau River State Forest, over 90,000 acres of public land, occupies the western and southern portions of the county and extends into Sawyer and Rusk counties. The South Fork of the Flambeau River originates in the northeastern corner of the county near Round Lake and flows generally southwest through the state forest before joining the North Fork. The terrain is glacial, rolling moraines covered in northern hardwoods, sugar maple, yellow birch, basswood, hemlock, and white pine where the old growth managed to survive the logging era. or where the Civilian Conservation Corps planted replacements in the 1930s. Swamps and bogs fill the low ground between the moraines. Beaver ponds back up the feeder creeks and create the marshy flats that attract deer, otter, mink, and everything else that depends on slow water and dense cover. This is trapping country. Has been for 300 years. The French voyageurs who came through in the 1700s were trading with the Ojibwe for beaver pelts taken from these same drainages. The fur trade built the economy of northern Wisconsin before the logging companies arrived and stripped the forests. And when the forests were gone and the loggers moved on, trapping remained. It was not a career that would make anyone rich. By the time Merle was running his own lines in the early 1980s, a good beaver pelt might bring $20 to $40. Mink maybe $15 to $30. Otter was the premium fur at $60 to $100. You could supplement a living with trapping if you had another income and knew your ground well enough to run an efficient line. It was seasonal work, late fall through early spring, and it demanded a specific kind of knowledge. Reading water, understanding animal behavior at a level that most people never develop, knowing which creek bends held mink runs and which beaver dams were active, and where the otter traveled between ponds. It was quiet, solitary, physically demanding work that put you in the most remote parts of the forest in the coldest months of the year, and the men who did it well had a relationship with the landscape that went deeper than recreation or even occupation.
Quick thing before we move on, I have this book coming out. It's called the DOGMAN Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. Been working on it for a long time, so if you want to check that out, links down below. Now let's get you back to the video.
They knew the country as the Ojibwe who trapped it before them knew it. By feel, by pattern, by the accumulation of thousands of hours spent watching water move, and animals move, and seasons turn in the same drainages year after year. Merle grew up in it. His father ran trap lines in Price County from the late 1950s through the early 80s, working the feeder creeks and beaver flowages south of the Flambeau River. Merle was setting snares by the time he was 10. By 14, he was running a short mink line on his own along a creek that fed into the South Fork about 4 miles from the family property. He graduated from Phillips High School in 1976 and went to work for a pulp mill in Park Falls, the Flambeau Paper Company, running a forklift in the yard where the log trucks dumped their loads. He worked at the mill for almost a decade, and during every trapping season, October through March, he spent his days off and his early mornings on his lines. By the mid-'80s, he was running over 40 sets across a territory that covered about 20 square miles of state forest and county land, south and west of Phillips. He was good at it. Merle's father had taught him the trade the way it had been taught for generations in Price County, by walking the lines together until the younger man could read the landscape as well as the older one. Merle could look at a creek bank and tell you within a few feet where a mink was traveling. He could read beaver sign, the cuttings, the drag marks, the scent mounds, and know whether a colony was established or transient, growing or declining, worth setting on or better left alone. He could identify tracks in snow, mud, sand, and frozen ground for every furred animal in the Wisconsin Field Guide: raccoon, muskrat, mink, otter, beaver, red fox, gray fox, coyote, bobcat, fisher, pine marten, skunk, weasel. He knew what each one looked like at a walk, at a run, on hard ground, in soft ground, in fresh snow, in old snow. That was the foundation of what he did. Reading sign, understanding what had moved through a piece of country and when and why. It was a skill set built over decades of practice in the same territory. And it made Merle the kind of observer whose field assessments you could trust, because he had spent his entire life calibrating his eye against a landscape he knew better than his own house. A man we will call Roy trapped the next drainage over, running lines along the creeks that fed the Flambeau from the east side of the state forest. Roy and Merle had grown up together, gone to the same school, worked the same kind of jobs in the mills and the woods, and spent their off-seasons walking the same frozen creek bottoms with trap baskets and stretching boards. Roy is important to this story for a reason that will become clear later. He was the only person Merle told about the pup for over 20 years. The only person who saw it. The only person who understood, when the consequences started arriving in the late 1990s, exactly what had happened and why. In October of 1987, Merle was running his coyote sets along a drainage about 6 miles south of the South Fork, in the state forest. in terrain that he had been trapping for over a decade. The drainage ran through a mix of hardwoods and cedar swamp, fed by several small creeks that came off the moraines to the east and west. Beaver activity was heavy that year. Several new dams had backed up the water and created flooded areas that changed the travel patterns of everything else in the drainage. Merle had repositioned some of his sets to account for the new water levels and was walking a feeder creek he had not visited in several weeks, checking for fresh coyote sign along the banks. The creek ran through a narrow draw between two moraine ridges, the kind of terrain that funnels animal movement into predictable corridors. Cedar and tag alder choked the banks. The light was going. Late afternoon in October in northern Wisconsin, when the daylight starts failing before you are ready for it. Merle was moving along the east bank, reading the mud for tracks, when a sound stopped him. A sound, high-pitched, rising and falling, coming from somewhere up the east slope of the draw, maybe 40 or 50 yards from the creek. His first thought was a fox. Red foxes produce a variety of calls, some of which sound remarkably like a distressed animal or even a human infant at a distance. Merle had heard every vocalization a red fox makes. This was close, but wrong. The pitch was lower than a fox kit, and there was a quality to it that he could not place, a roughness in the tone that sat somewhere between a canine whine and something he had never heard before. He followed the sound up the slope. The terrain climbed through mixed hardwoods, the leaf litter deep and dry, crunching under his boots. The sound was intermittent. It would call for several seconds, go quiet, then start again. As he got closer, Merle could tell it was coming from a small depression in the slope, a wash where decades of snowmelt had carved a shallow gully into the hillside and exposed the root system of a large hemlock. Under the roots, where the soil had eroded and created an overhang about 2 feet deep and 4 feet wide, something was moving. Merle crouched at the edge of the depression and looked in. What he saw was an animal curled in the back of the space under the roots. Small, roughly the size of a large house cat, dark coat, almost black, matted and dirty. It was trembling. When it registered his presence, it went still and pressed itself against the back wall of the den with a reflexive fear response that Merle had seen in every young canid he had ever encountered. Coyote pups do it. Fox kits do it. Wolf pups do it. The freeze. The body going rigid, eyes wide, trying to become invisible. Merle's first assessment was wolf pup. Gray wolves had been recolonizing parts of northern Wisconsin through the 1980s, dispersers from Minnesota crossing the Street, Croix River, and establishing territories in the forested counties of the northwest part of the state. By '87, confirmed packs were operating in Bayfield and Douglas counties, with scattered reports of lone wolves as far east as Price and Lincoln counties. A wolf pup in this drainage would have been unusual, but not impossible. The DNR was tracking wolf movement into the region, and the habitat was suitable. He reached in and pulled the animal out. It did not resist. It was too weak, or too cold, or too young to fight. He held it in both hands, bringing it up to eye level in the fading light, and his first clear look at the animal raised questions he would spend the next 3 decades failing to answer. The proportions were off. The head was too large for the body, which is common in young canids, but the shape of the skull was wrong. The muzzle was broad and heavy, extending forward from a cranium that seemed deeper and wider than a wolf pup of comparable size should have. The ears were large, triangular, standing erect on the skull in a way that looked more like an adult's ears than a pup's. Wolf pups at this age, maybe 3 to 4 months old based on the body size, typically have ears that are still somewhat floppy, not yet fully erect. These ears were upright and rigid, and they tracked towards sounds with a precision that Merle noticed immediately, because it was faster and more deliberate than what he was used to seeing in young animals. The eyes were wrong, open, focused, tracking his face with an intensity that did not match a typical canid stress response. Canid pups in distress either freeze and go vacant or thrash and snap. This animal was doing neither. It was watching him, studying him. The eyes were amber, set forward on the skull under a pronounced brow ridge, and the way they moved reminded Merle of something he could not identify at the time, and would not be able to articulate until years later. He said the animal looked at him how a person looks at someone who has walked into their house uninvited. Assessment, calculation, threat evaluation performed by an intelligence that was already at 3 or 4 months of age, thinking about what his presence meant rather than simply reacting to it. The feet were wrong. Merle had handled hundreds of canid pups over his trapping career. He had held coyote pups, fox kits, and domestic dog puppies. The feet on all of them were proportional to their bodies. Compact paws with 4 toes and a dew claw, pads that were soft in young animals and hardened with age. The feet on this animal were too large, grossly too large for the body. Each foot was roughly 3 inches long, which on a pup this size would be like a human infant born with the hands of a 5-year-old. The toes were long and articulated, spreading apart when the animal shifted its weight in a way that canid paws do not normally do, and the claws were thick, dark, curved, and already showing the hardness and sharpness that in a wolf would not develop until the animal was close to a year old. Merle held the animal and looked at it, and felt something he described to us as his brain trying to close a door. He said his mind was reaching for the word wolf, as a drowning man reaches for a rope, because wolf was the only thing in his experience that could come close to explaining what he was holding. But his hands were telling him a different story. The weight was wrong. The texture of the coat was wrong, coarser and denser than what you find on a wolf pup. The musculature under the coat was wrong, harder and more defined than any pup this age should have. And the smell was wrong. Canid pups smell like warm milk and damp hide. This animal had an odor that Merle described as heavy, musky, a smell that was not unpleasant, but was unfamiliar, and that he would later realize he had encountered once before, years earlier, in a stretch of swamp along the Flambeau, where something large had been bedding, and the crushed vegetation carried a scent he could not identify and never investigated. He looked around the den. No adult sign, no scat, no prey remains, no tracks leading in or out other than what might have been there for days, washed and blurred by rain. The den itself was crude, not dug out, the way a wolf den would be, with a tunnel leading to an enlarged chamber. Just a natural overhang created by erosion, barely large enough for the animal to curl up in. It looked temporary, a place something small had crawled into because it had nowhere else to go. Merle made a decision in that moment that would define the next 33 years of his life, and he made it the way people make most of the decisions that end up mattering, without enough information, under time pressure, based on instinct and habit rather than analysis. He put the animal inside his coat and carried it back to his truck. He drove home with the pup inside his jacket, pressed against his chest. It did not move. It was warm against his body and he could feel its heartbeat, fast and strong, and the rapid, shallow breathing of a small animal in stress. His wife was not home when he arrived. She worked the afternoon shift at the school district office in Phillips, and he brought the pup into the garage and set up a makeshift pen in a large dog crate he used for hauling gear. He lined it with old blankets, put in a bowl of water and some canned dog food, and watched the animal investigate its new space. It moved around the crate with a deliberateness that he noticed and filed away without understanding. It checked every corner. It pressed its nose against every seam in the wire. It tested the latch with its mouth. Then it ate the dog food, drank the water, and lay down. Merle called Roy that evening and told him he had found something in the woods that he could not identify. Roy drove over after supper and the two of them stood in the garage looking at the animal in the crate under the fluorescent lights and tried to figure out what they were dealing with. Roy's first reaction was the same as Merle's had been. Wolf. But Roy was a trapper with 20 years of field experience, and the longer he looked, the less certain he became. He noted the same things Merle had noticed: the head shape, the ears, the feet, the eyes that followed their conversation with an attention that neither man associated with a 3-month-old animal. Roy crouched in front of the crate, and the pup tracked him. When Roy shifted to the left, the pup's head turned smoothly to follow. When Roy raised his hand toward the wire, the pup did not flinch. It leaned forward. It studied his fingers. Roy pulled his hand back and stood up and said something to Merle that Merle remembers precisely. Roy said, "That thing does not look at you the way a dog looks at you." Over the next 3 weeks, Merle kept the animal in the garage. He fed it dog food, supplemented with raw venison from a doe he had taken during the archery season. The pup ate everything he gave it. It grew, rapidly, faster than any canid Merle had ever raised or observed. By the end of the first week, it was noticeably larger than when he had brought it home. By the end of the second week, it had outgrown the dog crate. Merle moved it to a larger enclosure he built from welded wire panels in the back corner of the garage, 6 feet square and 5 feet tall. The animal paced the enclosure continuously when it was awake, moving along the wire in a pattern that Merle described as purposeful rather than nervous. It was not the frantic circling of a stressed animal. It was the systematic inspection of a confined space by something looking for a way out. 2 things happened during those 3 weeks that pushed Merle toward the decision he eventually made. The first was the hands. By the end of the 2nd week, the pup's front feet had changed. The toes had lengthened and separated further, and when the animal gripped the wire of the enclosure, which it did frequently, the digits wrapped around the wire individually, flexing, closing. The dew claw, which in wolves and dogs is a vestigial digit positioned high on the leg, had migrated lower on this animal's forelimb and was functioning as an opposable thumb. Merle watched it grip the wire mesh the way a raccoon grips a branch, with articulated fingers and a grasping motion that bore no resemblance to a canid paw pressing against a surface. The claws had grown darker and thicker. Each one was nearly an inch long and came to a point that left scratches in the galvanized wire. The second thing was the sound. On the 14th night, Merle woke at 2 in the morning to something he heard through the wall between the house and the garage. A vocalization, low, continuous, rising and falling in a pattern that repeated 3 times and then stopped. It was not a howl. Merle knew what wolf howls sounded like, and coyote howls, and the yipping chorus that coyotes produce when a pack gathers. This was different. It was deeper. It vibrated at a frequency that Merle felt in his chest as much as heard with his ears. And it had structure, a repeating pattern of tonal shifts that did not sound random. It sounded organized. How language sounds organized even when you do not understand the words. He went to the garage. The pup was standing in the enclosure, and when Merle opened the door and turned on the light, it stopped vocalizing and looked at him. It was taller than it had been a week earlier. Standing on its hind legs with its front hands gripping the top rail of the wire enclosure, it was over 3 feet tall. A canid pup that was maybe 4 months old, standing upright in a welded wire pen in a garage in Price County, Wisconsin, looking at the man who had pulled it from a den under a hemlock root with an expression that Merle described as recognition. It knew who he was. It had learned him, as it had learned the dimensions of the enclosure and the schedule of its feedings and the sound of his truck pulling into the driveway. It had cataloged him, and the vocalization that had woken him, the low structured call that he felt in his ribs, had been directed outward, through the garage wall, through the cold October night, into the forest to the south, where the drainage ran through the cedar swamps and the moraine ridges, and the darkness held everything that Merle had spent his life studying and thought he understood. Merle stood in his garage at 2 in the morning looking at an animal that was not a wolf and not a dog and not anything in his experience, and he understood that he had a problem. The animal was growing fast. It was getting strong. The welded wire enclosure was not going to hold it much longer, and the vocalization, the call sent into the night from his garage, suggested that whatever this animal was, it was trying to contact others of its kind. If something answered, if an adult version of what was standing in his pen came looking for it, Merle did not want to be between them. He could not contact the DNR. He had pulled the animal from the wild without any kind of permit, and keeping an unidentified canid in his garage was a violation of state wildlife regulations regardless of what species it turned out to be. He could not take it to a veterinarian without answering questions he did not know how to answer, and he could not release it. It had been in captivity for 3 weeks. It was habituated to human feeding. Releasing a partially habituated large canid into the state forest during deer hunting season was a recipe for a confrontation between the animal and a hunter, and Merle did not think that confrontation would end well for the hunter. That left one option, and it was an option that existed only because of the particular time and place Merle was living in. In 1987, the regulation of roadside animal attractions in rural Wisconsin was minimal. USDA licensing under the Animal Welfare Act was required for commercial exhibitors, but enforcement in small towns along the north-central highway corridors was sporadic at best. Small operations, the kind that kept a few wolves, a black bear or 2, maybe some deer and a bison in pens along the highway and charged families $3 a head to walk through, operated on the margins of the regulatory system. Some were licensed, many were not. They existed because tourists driving the northern routes liked to stop and see animals, and because there was a steady supply of wildlife, orphaned, confiscated, or bred in captivity, that needed to go somewhere. Merle knew of one such place along Highway 8 east of Prentice, about 20 miles south of Phillips. A man, we will call him Lester, ran a small operation on a few acres just off the highway. He had wolves. He had a black bear that somebody had raised from a cub after shooting its mother during a nuisance call. He had a pen of white-tailed deer that people could feed from a bucket. He had a pair of coyotes that he had trapped himself. The operation was small, seasonal, open from May through October when the tourist traffic on Highway 8 justified the operating costs. Lester bought animals from trappers and hunters occasionally, and he had a reputation in the area as someone who would take an unusual animal off your hands without asking too many questions about where it came from. Merle drove to Lester's place on a Saturday morning in early November. He had the pup in a large dog kennel in the bed of his truck. Lester came out, looked in the kennel, and asked what it was. Merle said he had found it in a den and believed it was a wolf pup, possibly a hybrid of some kind, and that it was growing faster than anything he had ever seen. Lester looked at the animal for a long time. The pup looked back at Lester with the same steady, evaluating gaze that had unsettled Merle from the first moment. Lester asked how much Merle wanted for it. Merle said $100. Lester paid him in cash, loaded the kennel onto a flatbed beside the bear enclosure, and that was the end of Merle's direct involvement with the animal for the next 10 years. He drove home and went back to his trap lines and tried to stop thinking about what he had sold. He was not successful. The image of those amber eyes tracking his face, the grip of those articulated fingers on the welded wire, the sound of that low, structured vocalization vibrating through the wall of his garage at 2 a.m, all of it stayed with him the way certain memories stay, not fading with time but sharpening, gaining detail and weight as the years added context that he did not have at the moment of the experience. What he learned later, in fragments, from conversations with people who had visited Lester's operation over the following decade, was that the animal became the attraction's primary draw. Lester kept it in an enclosure he built specifically for it, chain link over a welded steel frame, 8 feet tall with a concrete floor and a corrugated metal roof. He advertised it as a wolf, and for the first couple of years, visitors accepted that explanation because the alternative was something they had no framework for. But as the animal grew, the wolf explanation became harder and harder to maintain. By the summer of 1990, 3 years after Merle had sold it, the animal was larger than any wolf Lester or his visitors had ever seen. Merle heard from a man who worked seasonally at Lester's place that the animal stood over 5 feet tall at the shoulder when it was on all fours, and that when it stood upright on its hind legs, which it did frequently, it cleared 7 feet. Its proportions had shifted dramatically from the puppy he had pulled out of the den. The chest was massive, deep and broad, carrying the bulk of its weight. The arms, and by now they were clearly arms, not forelegs, were long and heavily muscled, ending in hands with articulated fingers and thick black claws. The head retained the canine shape, the elongated muzzle, the erect pointed ears, the forward-set predator eyes, but it had grown to a size that dwarfed any wolf skull in existence. The jaw musculature was visible under the hide, heavy cords of muscle that gave the head a blocky, powerful appearance. It watched people. That was what everyone who visited the attraction noticed, and what nobody could comfortably explain. The wolves in Lester's other pens behaved like captive wolves. They paced, they avoided eye contact. They retreated to the back of their enclosures when visitors approached the fence. The animal Merle had sold him did none of these things. It stood at the front of its enclosure and watched, tracked individual visitors with its eyes as they walked past, turned its head to follow conversations, reacted to children's voices differently than to adult voices, becoming still and attentive when a child spoke, in a way that visitors found either fascinating or deeply uncomfortable depending on their disposition. A woman who visited in '92 told a friend of Merle's wife that the wolf in the big pen had looked at her in a way that made her feel like she was the one in the cage. Lester reinforced the enclosure 3 times. The first time because the animal bent the chain link at the bottom of one wall panel by gripping it and pulling, not pushing against it with its body, the way a bear tests a fence, gripping the wire mesh with both hands, and pulling it toward itself with a controlled force that deformed the galvanized links without breaking them. Lester replaced the chain link with heavy-gauge welded wire and added steel bars across the lower panels. The second reinforcement came after the animal figured out the gate latch. Lester had installed a standard chain link gate with a lever latch, the kind that you lift and pull. He came out one morning and found the animal standing outside the enclosure in the service yard behind the attraction. It had not broken anything. It had opened the gate. Lester installed a padlock and added a second hasp. The third reinforcement, sometime in '94 or '95, involved replacing the entire roof structure after the animal climbed the interior walls and pushed against the corrugated metal hard enough to bow it upward. Lester poured a concrete cap around the top of the enclosure and added angled steel brackets that prevented anything inside from reaching the roof panels. All of this Merle learned secondhand, in pieces, over years. He did not visit Lester's operation after selling the pup. He drove past it on Highway 8 occasionally and saw the sign by the road and the line of cars in the parking area during the summer months, and he thought about what was in that enclosure and felt what he described to us as a sick feeling that never completely went away. He knew he had sold an intelligence that should not be in a cage. He did not know what it was, but he knew it was intelligent in a way that made caging it different from caging a wolf or a bear. The way caging a person would be different. The recognition in its eyes when it looked at him in the garage. The way it had studied the latch on the dog crate. The structured vocalization. The way it tracked human speech. All of it pointed toward a level of awareness that made captivity something worse than confinement. It was imprisonment, and Merle had made it possible for $100 and the relief of having the problem out of his garage. In the fall of 1997, the animal escaped. Merle did not learn the details until months later, and even then, what he pieced together was incomplete because Lester was not talking to anyone about what happened, and the attraction closed permanently within weeks of the escape. What Merle gathered from people who knew Lester was this. The animal broke out of the enclosure on a night in late September, during a thunderstorm. The method was unclear. Lester told one person that the animal had exploited a weakness in the welded wire at a joint where two panels met, pulling the wire apart at the connection point, with enough force to create an opening large enough to pass through. He told another person that the animal had worked the hasp off the gate. A third account said the chain link run, connecting the main enclosure to a smaller exercise area, had been torn open from the inside, the wire peeled back in a way that suggested prolonged effort over hours, rather than a single explosive breach. However it happened, the result was the same. The enclosure was empty. The animal was gone. No tracks on the hard-packed gravel of the service yard, no blood on the wire, no hair caught on the metal edges, just an opening in the enclosure, and an absence where 10 years of captivity had ended sometime during the storm. Lester searched the property. He searched the surrounding woods on foot. He did not call the DNR. He did not call the sheriff. Reporting that a 7-foot bipedal canine had escaped from his roadside attraction was not something Lester was prepared to do, because doing so would raise questions about what exactly he had been keeping, where it came from, what permits he had, and why a dogman that did not match any species classification in the state of Wisconsin had been living in a chain-link enclosure off Highway 8 for a decade. The answers to those questions would have ended his operation, his livelihood, and possibly his freedom, because the animal he had been exhibiting for 10 years was not covered by any exotic animal permit, was not registered with any wildlife agency, and was not, as far as the state of Wisconsin was concerned, supposed to exist. Lester closed the attraction before the following season, sold the wolves and the bear to another exhibitor in Minnesota, sold the property within a year, moved to Iron County, never spoke publicly about what had happened, and when Merle finally reached him by phone in 2003, Lester said one sentence before hanging up. He said, "Do not call me about that thing ever again." The animal was gone. Into the North Woods. Into over 1 million acres of contiguous forest, stretching from Price County to the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest, to the state forests and county lands and private timber holdings that blanket the north-central part of the state. An animal that had spent a decade in captivity, that had been born in the drainages south of the Flambeau River, that understood human tools and structures and behavior at a level that no wildlife biologist would attribute to any known species. was now loose in the same landscape where Merle ran his trap lines and walked his creeks and checked his sets in the pre-dawn darkness of October mornings. And Merle, driving past the closed attraction on Highway 8 with the empty pens visible behind the sign that now read closed for season and would never read anything else again, felt the sick feeling in his stomach tighten into something harder, because he knew where it would go. He had pulled it from a den 6 miles south of the Flambeau River. If it remembered where it came from, and everything about its behavior suggested that its memory was vast and precise and unforgiving, then it would come back to the drainage where it was born, the drainage where Merle had been trapping for 20 years. The drainage, he walked alone, in the dark, checking sets along the same creek banks and beaver dams and otter runs that its kind had been using since before the logging companies stripped the timber and before the CCC crews replanted the pines and before anyone in Price County had a name for what lived in the deepest parts of the failed forest. Merle was right. It came back. And it did not come back alone. The first sign came in March of 1998. About 6 months after the escape. Merle was checking his beaver sets along the main feeder creek in the drainage where he had found the pup 11 years earlier, late winter in Price County. Snow still deep in the draws, crusted on top from the freeze-thaw cycle, soft underneath where the March sun had been working on it during the short afternoons. He was walking the creek bank at dawn, his usual routine, following the trail he had cut through the tag alder over years of use, when he came to a beaver dam he had been trapping on and off for the better part of a decade. The dam was destroyed, not breached by high water, which happens regularly when the spring melt overloads a dam that beavers have stopped maintaining, pulled apart. The sticks and mud that composed the dam had been ripped out from the top down, the structural members scattered on the downstream bank in a pattern that did not look like water damage or ice damage, or anything Merle had seen in 30 years of working around beaver dams. The sticks were broken, snapped clean, not chewed. Beaver-gnawed sticks show the characteristic tooth marks, the paired grooves of rodent incisors, and there were none on this debris. The sticks had been broken by something that gripped them and snapped them as you would break a pencil. The mud and vegetation that held the dam together had been pulled away in chunks, thrown onto the bank, leaving the creek running freely through the gap. Behind the dam, where the pond had been, the water level had dropped 3 feet. The mud of the exposed pond bed was frozen but showed impressions. Merle walked out onto the exposed bottom and found tracks, canid tracks, large. The right front print measured just over 6 inches long by 5 inches wide. The stride between tracks where the animal had walked along the dam before tearing it apart was 46 inches, consistent with a very large canid walking on all fours but at the extreme upper limit of anything in the biological record for wolves. Merle knew wolves. These tracks were larger than any wolf print he had ever measured. He stood over those tracks for a long time. The morning was still. The creek ran through the gap in the dam with a sound that was too loud for March. Water moving through space that should have been blocked. Merle felt something shift in the way he understood the landscape around him. A recalibration that had been building since the night the pup vocalized through his garage wall. And that, locked into place standing over 6-inch canid tracks in the mud of a destroyed beaver dam, 6 miles from the spot where he had found a den under a hemlock root in 1987. He cast the best track. He had plaster in his truck for this purpose. He mixed it in a coffee can, poured it into the impression, covered it with his hat to slow the drying, and went back to check the rest of his line. When he collected the cast 2 hours later, the plaster reproduction was clean and detailed. 4 toes with heavy claw impressions, a broad metacarpal pad. The overall proportions were canid, without question, but the scale was wrong for any species in Wisconsin. He put the cast in his truck and drove home, and sat at his kitchen table with it and a USGS topographic map of the area, and placed his first pin. He did not know he was starting a map that would eventually hold over 200 markers. Over the following weeks, Merle found more sign. Tree markings appeared on conifers along the perimeter of the drainage. Vertical gouges in the bark, running from about 5 feet to just over 7 feet, deep enough to expose the cambium, spaced in groups of 4 at roughly 3 inches apart. He had seen bear claw marks on trees his entire life, and these were different, higher, wider between the individual gouges, deeper. The reach implied an animal standing on its hind legs that was at least 7 feet tall, and the spacing between the marks corresponded to a hand wider than any black bear paw in Wisconsin. The marks formed a rough line, 5 trees over about 2 miles, enclosing the area around the destroyed beaver dam and the den site where Merle had found the pup. Territorial marking, the same behavior that wolves and bears use to define their claimed space, adapted by a predator that stood taller and reached higher, and left marks that said clearly and specifically that this piece of ground was occupied. Merle photographed every marked tree. He measured every one. He added pins to his map, and he kept trapping, because the season was not over and his income depended on working the lines, and because stopping would mean acknowledging what the evidence was telling him, and he was not ready for that yet. The first visual encounter happened on a morning in early April, during the last week of the trapping season. Merle was pulling his mink sets along the same feeder creek, dismantling the sets for the year, cleaning the traps and stacking them in his pack basket for the walk back to the truck. Dawn, thin gray light filtering through the bare hardwoods on the moraine ridges, the creek running high with snowmelt, loud enough to mask most sounds. He was crouching on the bank, working a trap loose from where it was anchored under a root when he had the sensation of being watched. Trappers learn to pay attention to that feeling. Merle had experienced it hundreds of times over his career. Usually it was a deer, standing upslope and staring at him, or a hawk in the canopy, or nothing at all. Just the prickle of a nervous system that had evolved to detect predator attention, and sometimes fired without cause. But this was different. The feeling was stronger than he had ever experienced it, and it came with a quality he described as directional. He did not just feel watched. He felt that the watching was coming from a specific point in the forest behind him and above him, on the east slope of the moraine ridge, roughly 40 yards away. He stood up slowly, turned, looked up the slope. It was standing between 2 sugar maples about 35 yards up the ridge, upright, on 2 legs. The morning light was behind it, which meant Merle was looking at a silhouette rather than full detail. But the silhouette was enough to eliminate every species in his catalog. It was too tall for a bear on its hind legs, too narrow through the hips for a person. The shoulders were too wide for the waist, and the arms hung too far down, well past where the knees would be on a human of that height. The head, in profile, showed the elongated muzzle and the erect pointed ears that Merle had last seen on a pup curled under a hemlock root 11 years earlier. He could not estimate the height precisely because the terrain and the backlighting made scale difficult, but the figure was taller than him, and Merle is 6 feet even. He guessed 7 feet, maybe more. The body was dark. The coat appeared uniform in color, black or very deep brown. The posture was not stiff or awkward. It stood as a person stands when they have stopped to watch something, weight balanced, body at ease. Head turned slightly to maintain a direct line of sight to the object of its attention. That object was Merle. It was watching him as he had spent his entire life watching animals. With attention, with assessment, with the patient calculation of an observer gathering information and has no intention of moving until it has what it came for. Merle did not move. His hands were still holding the trap he had been pulling from the root, and his trap basket was on the bank behind him, and his rifle was in his truck a quarter mile away because you do not carry a rifle while pulling sets. He stood on the creek bank and looked at the thing on the ridge and felt the adrenaline dump hit his bloodstream like a shot of boiler water. The sudden heat across his chest and the roaring in his ears and the fine tremor in his hands that made the trap rattle against the chain. The figure watched him for what Merle estimated was 10 or 12 seconds. Long enough for him to register the proportions, the posture, the color, the head shape. Long enough for the thing to register him in return. Then it turned. The motion was fluid, the upper body rotating first and the legs following, and it went down onto 4 legs in a transition so smooth it looked rehearsed. It moved up the slope and into the timber on all 4s, covering ground in long strides that put it out of sight within seconds. No sound, no crash of branches or crunch of frozen leaf litter. Just a shape moving through the trees with the efficiency of a presence that had been moving through this forest for a very long time. Merle did not finish pulling his sets that morning. He walked back to his truck, moving fast, checking behind him every few steps, and drove home. He sat in his kitchen with his hands still shaking and thought about what he had seen, and every thought led back to the same place. The pup, the den, the amber eyes tracking his face in the garage, the hands gripping the wire. the low vocalization in the night. He had sold a baby dogman to a roadside attraction for $100, and now the grown version was standing on a ridgeline 35 yards away, watching him pull traps on a creek bank in the same drainage where it was born. He told Roy. Drove to Roy's place that afternoon and sat in Roy's kitchen and told him everything. The escape, the destroyed beaver dam, the tracks, the tree markings, and what he had seen on the ridge that morning. Roy listened the way he always listened, quietly, with his hands around a coffee cup, not interrupting. When Merle finished, Roy asked one question. He asked whether Merle thought the thing he had seen was the same animal he had sold to Lester. Merle said he did not know for certain, but the head shape and the coloring were consistent, and the location, the same drainage where he had found the pup, was too specific to be coincidence. Roy was quiet for a while. Then he told Merle a piece of information that changed the shape of the story. Roy said he had been finding tracks on his own trapline, on the east side of the state forest, for the past 2 months. Tracks he had not been able to identify. Large canid prints, bipedal gait pattern, stride lengths in the mid-40s. He had assumed they were from an unusually large wolf, one of the dispersers from the Minnesota packs that the DNR had been tracking. He had not mentioned them to Merle because large canid tracks on a trapline are not unusual enough to warrant a phone call. But the stride lengths had bothered him. They were too long for any wolf, and the gait pattern, the rear foot landing independently rather than registering in the front foot's track, was wrong for a quadruped. Roy had been puzzling over those tracks for weeks without reaching a conclusion that satisfied him. Now he had a conclusion, and it was worse than anything he had considered, because it meant the animal Merle had encountered on the ridge was not the only one. Roy's trapline was over 4 miles from Merle's. If both of them were finding sign, then whatever had escaped from Lester's operation, or whatever had been living in these woods all along, there was more than one. Merle had found a pup in 1987. A pup implies parents. Parents imply a breeding population. The pup had been removed, but the population it came from had remained invisible, in the same forest where 2 men had been trapping for over 20 years without knowing what was sharing the drainage with them. If you have spent any time in the Flambeau River State Forest, if you have paddled the South Fork, or walked the trails along the moraine ridges south of Highway 70, or camped at one of the dispersed sites in the interior, where the forest closes in around you after dark, and the only sounds are wind, and water and the occasional great horned owl calling from a hemlock, you know the country I am describing. You also know that the forest between Phillips and Winter, between the South Fork and the headwaters creeks that feed it from the east, is some of the least visited terrain in the state. Canoeists stick to the river. Hikers stay on the maintained trails. Hunters drive the logging roads and hunt the edges of clear cuts where the deer browse. The interior of those moraines, the cedar swamps, and the creek bottoms, and the old hemlock stands that survived the logging era, in the draws where the terrain was too steep to cut. That country sees almost nobody from year to year except trappers, and there are fewer trappers every decade as the old ones die or retire and the young ones do not replace them. Let me know in the comments if you have ever had anything unusual happen out there, because the reports I have been pulling together from that part of Price County go back further than anyone realizes. Through the spring and summer of 1998, Merle did not go into the drainage. He told himself it was because the trapping season was over, and there was no reason to be there. The real reason was that he did not want to encounter the thing on the ridge again, and he did not want to think about what his role in its story meant. He worked at the mill. He maintained his equipment. He scouted for the upcoming deer season on different ground, moving his plans east, away from the drainage, into terrain that did not carry the specific dread that the familiar creeks and ridges now held for him. In September, a month before the trapping season opened, Merle drove to the drainage. He told himself he was scouting. What he was actually doing was checking whether the territorial markings were still there. They were. The trees he had photographed in March still bore the vertical gouges, darkened now with oxidation and resin, but unmistakable. And there were new ones, 3 more marked trees, extending the perimeter of the territory to the northwest, closer to the county road that ran along the north edge of the state forest. The territory was expanding, or the thing that owned it was adjusting its boundaries to encompass more ground. Merle walked the perimeter he had mapped and counted the marked trees. 11 total. They formed an irregular circle, roughly 4 miles in diameter, centered on the stretch of Feeder Creek where the destroyed beaver dam had been and where the original den under the hemlock root still existed, now empty. The root system collapsed over the entrance. 4 miles in diameter was approximately 12.5 square miles. That was a large territory for a single animal, comparable to a wolf pack's home range in this habitat. For a solitary large predator, it was about right. He found tracks again, in the soft substrate along the creek, fresh. The same oversized canid prints, the same bipedal gait pattern. And something new, a second set of tracks, smaller, walking parallel to the first set at a distance of about 10 feet. 2 individuals, walking together along the creek, maintaining consistent spacing, paired movement, deliberate, the kind of coordinated travel that suggests a social bond rather than 2 animals happening to be in the same place at the same time. Merle measured the smaller tracks, 4.5 inches long by 3 3/4 wide, smaller than the 6-inch prints he had cast in March, but the morphology was identical. Same toe structure, same claw marks, same pad proportions. A second individual, smaller than the first, walking beside it. A mate, possibly, or a juvenile from a previous litter, or another of the pup's kind that had been there all along, in the same forest, in the same drainage, undetected for decades. The pairing meant a breeding population. Merle had known that since Roy told him about the tracks on the east side, but seeing it in the substrate, 2 sets of impossible prints, walking side by side along a creek he had been trapping since he was 14 years old, made it real in a way that abstract knowledge does not. There were at least 2 dogman in this drainage, possibly more, and they were established, territorial, marking their boundaries and maintaining them the way any apex predator maintains territory. This was not a transient passing through. This was a population that had claimed this ground and intended to keep it. Merle went back to the truck and sat behind the wheel for a long time before he started the engine. He was trying to decide whether to run his trapline this season or pull his equipment and find new ground. The decision was harder than it should have been. He had been trapping this drainage for over 2 decades. His sets were dialed in. His routes were efficient. His knowledge of the terrain and the animal patterns was comprehensive and specific, the product of thousands of hours of observation refined over years. Moving to new ground would mean starting from scratch, learning new creeks, new travel corridors, new dam locations, new mink runs. It would cut his catch in half for the first season at least, maybe 2 seasons, while he rebuilt his understanding of unfamiliar terrain. But staying meant sharing the drainage with a predator that could see him in the dark, that moved faster than he could, that understood his routines and his routes and his schedule, and that had a specific history with him that he could not evaluate from its perspective. Did the animal that stood on the ridge recognize the man who had pulled it from a den as a pup? Did it remember the garage, the crate, the 3 weeks of captivity, before Merle handed it off to a man who locked it in a chain-link pen for 10 years? Did it associate Merle with the decade it spent in a cage, watching tourists walk past, learning human behavior through the wire mesh of an enclosure it could not escape until the night it finally did? Merle did not know. He could not know, but everything he had observed about the dogman's intelligence, from the way the pup had studied the latch on the dog crate, to the way the adult had watched him from the ridge with an attention that felt evaluative rather than predatory, suggested that it was capable of making those connections, of remembering, of assigning meaning to events and to the humans involved in them. And if that was true, then Merle walking into the dogman's territory every morning before dawn to check traps along the creek where it had been born, and from which it had been taken, was an act whose implications he could not predict and could not control. He ran his trapline that season. He made the practical choice, the financial choice, the choice that a man in Price County in 1998 makes when his supplemental income depends on working ground he knows. He ran his sets along the feeder creeks. He checked his traps in the pre-dawn dark. He walked the same trails he had walked for 20 years, through the cedar swamps and along the moraine ridges and past the den site where it had all started. And he carried a rifle for the first time in his trapping career, not the .30-06 he used for deer season. A 12-gauge pump loaded with slugs, which is what you carry in the Northwoods when the threat might come from close range and from any direction, and might weigh 300 pounds or more, and might be faster than you over the first 50 yards. He did not see the dogman again that season, but the sign was everywhere. Tracks along the creeks after every rain, fresh territorial markings on trees, the gouges still weeping resin when he found them. Twice he found deer carcasses that had been killed and partially consumed in ways that did not match bear predation. The kills were clean, necks broken, throats opened by teeth. The feeding pattern was selective, large muscles stripped from the hindquarters and shoulders with the precision of an intelligence that understood anatomy. The organs left untouched in the body cavity. Bears eat everything. Wolves eat in a pattern that starts with the internal organs and works outward. Whatever was killing deer in this drainage was eating like neither of those predators. And the sounds. On 3 occasions during November, trapping in the pre-dawn darkness with a headlamp and the 12-gauge slung across his back, Merle heard vocalizations, the same low, structured, oscillating call he had heard through his garage wall 11 years earlier, coming from the ridge to the east, maybe a quarter-mile away, lasting for 10 or 15 seconds, then silence, then a response from somewhere to the south, maybe half a mile distant. 2 voices, calling and answering. The calls had pattern and repetition, tonal shifts that repeated in sequences, and a frequency range that Merle felt in his chest and in his jaw before his ears fully registered the sound. He stood in the dark on a frozen creek bank, listening to that exchange, and understood what he had been refusing to understand since March. They knew he was there. They had always known he was there. The territorial markings were not posted for other dogmen. They were posted for him. The tracks along his trapline routes were not coincidence. They were inspection. The dogman on the ridge had not stumbled across him. It had been watching for him, waiting for him to come back to the drainage at the start of the season, confirming that the man who had taken the pup from the den was still operating in the same territory. He was being monitored, the same way he monitored the animals on his trapline, reading their sign, tracking their movements, predicting their behavior based on pattern and habit. The dogman was monitoring him. It knew his schedule. It knew his routes. It knew which creek banks he walked, and which sets he checked, and where he parked his truck, and how long he spent at each location. It had built a model of his behavior the same way Merle had spent his career building models of animal behavior, through steady observation and the patient accumulation of data, and the vocalization exchange he was hearing in the dark, the calls passing between 2 positions on either side of his trapline, might have been about him. A report, an update. Something is here. It is the same one. It is carrying the long gun now. It is on the creek below the second dam. The idea was absurd. The idea was also supported by everything he knew about how the dogman behaved, and everything he knew about the intelligence it had demonstrated since it was 3 months old and studying the latch on a dog crate in his garage. Merle finished the season. His catch was lower than usual, which he attributed partly to the disruption of the beaver dam in March, and partly to a general decrease in fur-bearing animal activity in the drainage that he could not fully explain. Fewer mink on the creek banks, fewer otter slides. The beaver had rebuilt the dam, but the colony was smaller, and their cuttings were concentrated closer to the lodge than Merle had ever seen them, as if they were reluctant to forage at distance. The prey base in the drainage was contracting. The animals that had lived there for years were adjusting their behavior to the presence of something at the top of the food chain, and Merle was watching the ecosystem respond in real time to a predator that the DNR did not know existed. The encounter that Merle considers the most important, the one that shifted his understanding from observation to certainty, happened in November of 2001, 3 years into the pattern of shared territory and mutual surveillance. It was the 3rd week of the trapping season. Cold had come early that year, locking the smaller creeks under ice by mid-November and concentrating animal movement along the main feeder and the stretches of open water below the beaver dams. Merle was checking a mink set on a section of the creek about a mile south of the destroyed dam site when he noticed something on the opposite bank that stopped him. A trap. One of his traps. Not in the water where he had placed it. On the bank, 10 feet from the creek edge, sitting on a flat rock, right side up, jaws open, pan set, chain coiled beside it. The trap had been in the water, anchored to a drowning wire under a submerged root, positioned at a mink run where the animals climbed the bank to cross a log. Merle had set it himself 2 days earlier. He knew exactly where it had been. Now it was on the bank, on a rock, displayed as if someone had placed it there for him to find. He crossed the creek. The water was knee-deep and cold enough to make his legs ache. He stood over the trap and looked at it. The trap was undamaged. The drowning wire was still attached, coiled neatly beside the chain. The anchor stake had been pulled from the creek bed, which was soft clay and would not have required enormous force. But the stake was intact, not bent or broken. The trap had been removed from the set with what appeared to be care. Not torn loose, extracted. The drowning wire had been unhooked from the submerged root, which meant something had reached into cold water, found the clip that attached the wire to the root, and released it. That required fine motor control. That required hands. Merle looked at the ground around the rock. The substrate was frozen leaf litter, hard enough that tracks would not register clearly. But in a patch of soft mud near the water's edge, he found impressions. A single footprint, bipedal, canid morphology, 6 inches long. The same track he had been finding for 3 years. He stood there for a long time. The forest was quiet in the way that the forest got quiet when something large was near. No bird calls, no squirrel chatter, just wind in the bare canopy and the creek running under the thin ice that had formed along the margins overnight. The trap on the rock was a message. Merle had spent his adult life setting traps along these creeks, and now something had removed one of his traps, carried it to a visible location, and placed it where he would find it. The care with which it had been extracted from the set, the drowning wire unclipped rather than broken, the anchor pulled rather than torn, told him that whatever had done this understood what the trap was and how it worked. It had studied his sets. It had watched him build them, or it had examined them after he left and figured out the mechanical relationships between the components, the way the jaws closed, the way the chain connected to the wire, connected to the anchor, connected to the root, and then it had disassembled one and left it for him, as you might leave a note for someone in a language you know they speak. The message, as Merle interpreted it, was clear. I know what you are doing. I know what these things are for. I took this one and put it where you would see it. Consider what that means about what else I can do. He pulled every trap in the drainage that day. All of them. 42 sets, dismantled and packed out and loaded into his truck. He did not come back to the drainage for the rest of the season. He ran his remaining sets on ground to the east, on Roy's side of the state forest, where the sign was less concentrated and the encounters had been limited to tracks and the occasional distant vocalization. His catch for the season was the lowest it had been in 15 years. He did not care. The trap incident was the second strongest piece of evidence in Merle's account. The strongest came later, in the winter of 2007, and it is the encounter that made him stop trapping altogether. But the trap removal is where the intelligence question stops being theoretical and becomes operational. An animal that pulls a trap from the water is unusual but not unprecedented. Raccoons do it. Bears stumble into sets and tear them loose. But an animal that removes a trap from the water with the drowning wire intact, carries it to a visible location, places it on a rock with the jaws open and the components arranged as if for inspection, and leaves a single footprint beside it as a signature. That is something else entirely. That is communication. Directed, intentional, addressed to a specific individual. The dogman knew whose trap it was. It knew the man would return to check the set. It knew the man would find the trap on the rock and understand what it meant. It was operating on a theory of mind, an understanding that the human had thoughts and intentions and would interpret the display as a message rather than as random displacement. Theory of mind in non-human species has been debated by biologists for decades. The question of whether animals understand that other beings have their own thoughts, beliefs, and intentions remains one of the most contentious issues in animal cognition research. Great apes demonstrate it in limited contexts. Corvids show evidence of it. Wolves display social intelligence that implies some degree of perspective-taking within pack dynamics. But nothing in the peer-reviewed literature describes a wild animal removing a human tool from its context, transporting it, and arranging it as a deliberate display for the human who placed it. That behavior exists in a category that wildlife science does not have a name for. The years between 2001 and 2007 were the period when Merle accumulated the bulk of his evidence. He continued to find tracks and territorial markings in the drainage, even in years when he did not trap there. He made periodic checks, walking the perimeter of the territory he had mapped, photographing new markings, casting tracks when the substrate allowed. He had started using trail cameras in 2003, mounting them on trees along the creek and the game trails that crossed the moraine ridges. He lost cameras at a rate that exceeded anything he could attribute to bears or weather. Of the first 6 cameras he deployed, 4 were destroyed within a month, pulled from trees, housings cracked, SD cards missing or crushed. One was found on the ground with the lens pointing at the sky, the mounting strap pulled through the bark of the tree in a channel that was too narrow for a bear's paw, but consistent with a hand gripping the strap and pulling downward. One was never found at all, just the bracket still attached to the tree, and a raw spot on the bark where the camera had been wrenched loose. By 2005, Merle had adapted his methods. He built concealment housings from bark and natural materials. He mounted cameras inside hollow stumps and dead trees, angling the lens through natural openings. He used scent elimination protocols borrowed from his trapping practice. Some of these survived long enough to capture footage, brief infrared clips of large shapes moving past the lens in the dark, silhouettes that confirmed the proportions he had seen on the ridge in '98. Large, upright, canine head in profile, arms that hung past the hips. One clip showed a figure pausing on the trail, turning toward the camera position and tilting its head in a gesture that Merle described as a person looking at something they recognize. Then it continued on its way. The clip that Merle sent to this channel, the one from 2021 that opened this story, was captured on a camera that had been in place for 11 days before the animal found it and pulled it from the tree. The footage was infrared. The shape that crosses the frame is large, upright, and moving with the unhurried stride of something that owns the ground it is walking on. When it turns toward the camera, the head shape is visible for a fraction of a second before the infrared washes out from proximity. Then the image shakes and goes dark. The camera was found the next morning, face down in the leaf litter, housing cracked, SD card intact. Whatever pulled it from the tree had done so with enough force to crack the housing, but not enough to shatter it. The restraint in the force was itself notable. The dogman was strong enough to destroy the camera completely, but chose not to. It disabled it and moved on. In 2004, Merle made a discovery that expanded the story beyond his personal experience and connected it to something much older and much larger. He had been walking the western perimeter of the territory, photographing a new set of tree markings, when he came across an old logging road that had been out of use since the 1940s. The road was barely visible, a linear depression in the forest floor where the canopy had never fully closed because the compacted soil inhibited tree growth. Merle had known about the road for years but rarely walked it because it did not connect to any of his trapping routes. On this day, he followed it north for about a mile and came to a clearing. The clearing was man-made, about an acre, the remnant of a logging camp from the era when the big timber companies had stripped northern Wisconsin. The stumps of the original trees were still visible. Sugar, maple, and yellow birch and hemlock rotted down to dark mounds that were gradually being absorbed by the forest floor. At the north edge of the clearing, partially buried in leaf litter and the accumulated debris of 60 years, Merle found the remains of a stone foundation, a cabin, small, maybe 12 by 16, with a fieldstone chimney base still standing at one end. He had never noticed it before. The forest had reclaimed it to the point where it was invisible unless you were standing directly on top of it. He looked around the clearing, and he found markings on the trees at the edge. Old markings, not fresh gouges with pale wood and running resin, but healed scars, the bark grown back over the wounds in thick ridges of scar tissue that showed the tree's attempt to repair damage that had been done to it many years earlier. Merle examined the closest one, a red pine about 18 inches in diameter, and estimated from the growth of the scar tissue that the original marks had been made at least 30 or 40 years ago, maybe longer. The spacing was identical to the fresh territorial markings he had been documenting. Groups of 4, 3 inches apart, running vertically from 5 feet to over 7. The marks predated Merle's pup by decades. Whatever was living in this drainage had been marking territory here since at least the 1960s, maybe earlier. The pup Merle had found in '87 was not the first generation. It was part of a population that had been established in these woods for at least as long as the forest had been growing back from the logging era, and possibly much longer than that. The connection to indigenous tradition in this region is documented and specific. The Lac du Flambeau Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa, whose reservation lies about 25 miles northeast of Phillips in Vilas County, has occupied this part of Wisconsin since the mid-1700s. Their name for the area, Waswaganing, means the place of spearing fish by torchlight, a reference to the traditional practice of night fishing with birch bark torches that the French fur traders observed when they arrived in the region. The Ojibwe relationship with this landscape spans centuries, and the knowledge base that comes with that relationship encompasses every aspect of the natural world, including aspects that Western science has never formally acknowledged. Merle is not Ojibwe and does not claim access to indigenous traditional knowledge. But Roy's family had connections to the Lac du Flambeau community, and Roy had grown up hearing fragments of stories from older relatives that referenced beings in the deep forest that were neither animal nor human. The stories were never told in full, at least not to Roy, who was on the edges of the tradition rather than at its center. But the fragments he heard described large, upright beings associated with specific territories in the forest, beings that the Ojibwe had known about and maintained a respectful distance from for as long as anyone could remember. The word Roy, recalled being used in Ojibwe, was one that his grandmother spoke rarely and always in a lowered voice, and the closest translation he could offer was something like the one who walks alongside, which implied a dogman that occupied the same landscape as humans, but on different terms and with different rules. When Roy shared these fragments with Merle asked whether the older people in the community would know what he had found in the drainage. Roy said the older people already knew. He said the traditions were not speculation or mythology. They were accumulated observation, passed down across generations in the same way that Merle's father had passed down his knowledge of trapping. The Ojibwe had been in this country for over 250 years, and their ancestors, the broader Anishinaabe peoples, had been in the Great Lakes region for much longer than that. If something large and intelligent and territorial had been living in the forests of northern Wisconsin, the Ojibwe would have known about it long before any Europeans set foot in the territory. That indigenous context reframes the encounter in a way that Merle struggled with for years. He had thought of the pup as an anomaly, a strange animal found in a den, out of place, unexplained. The territorial markings and the tracks in the encounters that followed the dogman's escape from Lester's attraction, those were consequences of his decision to sell the pup, ripples spreading from a single bad choice. But if the Ojibwe traditions were describing the same beings that Merle was encountering, then the dogman in the drainage were not anomalies at all. They were a population embedded in the landscape for centuries, known to the indigenous peoples who lived alongside them, invisible to the European-descended population that had logged the forest and built the towns and run the trap lines without ever recognizing what shared the ground with them. The pup Merle found was not lost. It was not abandoned. It was a member of a species that had been there all along, and Merle's removal of it from its den was not a rescue. It was a kidnapping, a young animal taken from its family group by a predator it could not resist, sold into captivity by a man who did not understand what he was holding, and imprisoned for 10 years in a chain-link cage along a highway, while its family searched the drainage for it and left markings on the trees and called into the night with structured vocalizations that might have been, in some way Merle would never be able to verify, calls directed at their missing young. That reframing is what Merle carried into the next decade. The guilt that had been a dull ache since he sold the pup became something sharper and more specific. He had not just made a mistake. He had participated in an act of violence against a species that the original inhabitants of this land had understood and respected for centuries, a species that had maintained its territory and its anonymity through an intelligence so refined that generations of trappers and loggers and hunters had walked through its home without knowing it was there. And Merle, through a combination of bad luck and bad judgment and $100 in cash, had disrupted that anonymity in a way whose consequences he was still living with over a decade later. The broader dogman phenomenon in the Great Lakes region provides context for what Merle encountered, and the parallels are close enough to reinforce rather than undermine his account. Linda Godfrey spent 3 decades documenting encounters with upright canine beings across Wisconsin, Michigan, and beyond, and the behavioral patterns she identified are consistent with what Merle observed: territorial behavior, anchored to specific geographic features, nocturnal activity with rare daytime sightings, awareness of human technology, including trail cameras, which Godfrey's sources reported being destroyed or displaced across multiple states, deliberate restraint in encounters with humans, choosing to warn and withdraw rather than attack, association with water sources and dense forest cover, and the institutional silence that surrounds every credible report, the gap between what witnesses observe and what the system is willing to process. The Steve Cook connection is relevant here. In 1987, the same year Merle found the pup, a disc jockey at a radio station in Traverse City, Michigan, recorded a song called "The Legend" as an April Fool's prank. The song described the Michigan Dogman, a bipedal canine that Cook said he had invented entirely. But after the song aired, the station received hundreds of calls from people across northern Michigan and Wisconsin who had seen exactly what the song described. Encounters that predated the song by decades. Witnesses who had been carrying their experiences in silence because they thought nobody would believe them. Cook's invented legend turned out to be an accidental catalog of a real phenomenon, and the reports that flooded in after the legend aired described a being whose physical characteristics and behavior matched what Merle had been observing in Price County with a consistency that is difficult to dismiss. The 1887 Wexford County lumberjack sighting, which the Michigan Dogman research community considers the foundational modern encounter, describes 2 men in a logging camp along the Manistee River who encountered a being with the body of a man and the head of a dog. Wexford County borders Lake County in the same north-central Michigan forest belt that has produced more dogman reports than any other region in North America. The being described in 1887, upright posture, canine head, heavy build, intelligent behavior, matches what Merle saw on the ridge in 1998, with enough precision that either witnesses separated by over a century and 500 miles independently fabricated identical accounts, or they are describing the same kind of animal. The Gable film, a piece of footage that circulated in the late 2000s as potential dogman evidence before being confirmed as a deliberate hoax, is worth mentioning here because its debunking actually strengthened the case for real sighting reports rather than weakening it. The Gable film taught the dogman research community to be more rigorous about evaluating visual evidence, which meant that reports that survived the heightened scrutiny were taken more seriously than they would have been before the hoax. Merle's trail camera footage, while brief and limited in quality, shows none of the hallmarks of fabrication that characterize the Gable film. The camera was positioned for wildlife monitoring, not for staging. The dogman enters the frame from a natural game trail at a natural pace. Its behavior, upon noticing the camera, the pause, the head tilt, the continued movement, is consistent with the camera awareness behavior documented across dozens of independent reports. The footage does not prove the existence of dogman. No single piece of footage could. But it is consistent with a real animal captured in an uncontrolled field setting, and it is supported by 11 years of physical evidence collected by a trained wildlife observer in the same territory. The encounter that ended Merle's trapping career happened on December 11th, 2007. He remembers the date because it was his wedding anniversary, and he had promised his wife he would be home by noon. He was running a short check on his remaining sets in the drainage, a reduced line of maybe 15 traps that he was still maintaining despite everything, because the income mattered, and because walking away from the last of his sets would mean admitting that the drainage belonged to something else now, and that his 30-year claim on it had been overridden by something he could not fight, and could not report, and could not explain to anyone who had not seen what he had seen. It was early morning, cold. The temperature had dropped below 0 overnight, and the air was so still that Merle could hear the creek ice cracking from 100 yards away. He was walking the trail along the south bank of the main feeder, heading toward a beaver dam where he had a set for otter, when he rounded a bend in the creek and found himself looking at the dogman from a distance of about 20 yards. It was standing in the creek, in the water. The creek at that point was maybe 3 feet deep and 4 feet wide, running between banks of frozen mud and overhanging cedar. The dogman was standing in the middle of the channel, water up to its shins, completely still. It was facing upstream, away from Merle, and it was looking at something in the water, fishing, or watching the water the way a heron watches, patient and focused, waiting for something to move beneath the surface. Merle stopped. The 12-gauge was slung across his back. He did not reach for it. He stood on the trail and looked at the animal in the creek, and for the first time in over a decade of encounters, he saw it clearly. Full daylight. No backlighting. No infrared distortion. No distance that reduced it to a silhouette. 20 yards. Close enough to see the texture of its coat, which was dark brown, almost black on the back and shoulders, fading to a slightly lighter tone on the chest and belly. Close enough to see the musculature of the shoulders and the upper arms, which were dense and layered in a way that reminded him of the working dogs he had known, the kind of dogs bred for pulling and carrying, except scaled up to a degree that made the comparison feel inadequate. The hands were visible, hanging at its sides, long-fingered, the claws dark and curved, the skin of the palms visible through the sparse hair on the underside of the digits. The head was in profile. He could see the full shape of the skull, the elongated muzzle, the erect triangular ears, the pronounced brow ridge above the eyes. The jaw was heavy, the masseter muscles visible under the hide as thick pads of tissue that gave the head a squared-off appearance from the side. The ears rotated independently, tracking sounds from different directions the way a deer's ears do, with a speed and precision that exceeded anything Merle associated with domestic canines. It was enormous. Standing in the creek, the water coming to just below its knees, the animal was taller than Merle. He estimated 7.5 feet based on its height relative to the cedar branches that overhung the bank, branches he had walked under thousands of times and knew the clearance of intuitively, the weight he could only guess at. But the way its legs displaced the water, the solidity of its stance in a current strong enough to push against his own legs when he waded that stretch, suggested something between 300 and 400 pounds. It stood in the moving water, as if the current were not there. Merle watched it, for what he estimates was 15 seconds before it noticed him. 15 seconds of unobstructed observation at close range. Enough time for his trapper's eye to catalog details that his conscious mind would spend years trying to process. The way the coat lay flat against the body in some areas and stood rougher in others. The way a wild animal's covering varies in texture across different body regions. The way the shoulders rolled slightly when it shifted its weight. The same subtle motion you see in a large dog adjusting its stance. The scar was on the left shoulder. A pale line running from the top of the shoulder blade down and forward toward the chest, roughly 8 inches long, irregular, the hair growing thin and patchy over the scar tissue. It was healed, years old, but clearly visible against the dark surrounding hide. Merle had never seen this animal at close range in daylight before, and the scar was new information. He stared at it, and as he stared, something connected in his memory that made his stomach drop. The pup he had pulled from the den in 1987 had been scratched. Merle had noticed it when he held the animal in the garage under the fluorescent lights, a raw spot on the left shoulder. Not deep, the kind of scrape that a young animal might get crawling through a narrow space or being carried in an adult's mouth. He had thought nothing of it at the time, a minor abrasion on a pup that had been lying in a dirt den under a tree root. But the location was the same, left shoulder, running from the top of the blade toward the chest. The scratch on the pup had been small, superficial, the kind of wound that would heal without a trace on any normal animal. On this animal, 20 years later, it had healed into a scar, visible, permanent, a mark that identified this specific individual as the same animal Merle had held in his hands as a pup and sold to a man with a roadside animal attraction for $100 in November of 1987. Merle was looking at the pup, grown, free, standing in the creek where it had been born, in the drainage where Merle had found it, 20 years and a decade of captivity later, and the scar on its shoulder was the proof that no amount of rationalization could explain away. This was the same animal, the same individual. It had escaped from Lester's cage, navigated back to the drainage of its birth across at least 20 miles of forest and highway, re-established itself in its natal territory, and had been sharing that territory with the man who had taken it from its den for over a decade. The figure turned its head. Slowly, The ears rotated first, locking onto the direction of whatever sound Merle had made, or the scent his body was sending downwind. Then the head followed. It turned and looked at him across 20 yards of frozen creek bank and cedar swamp, and the amber eyes that Merle had last seen studying him through the wire of a dog crate in his garage locked onto his face and held. Merle described the seconds that followed as the longest of his life. The animal looked at him. He looked at the dogman. Neither moved. The creek ran between them. The cold pressed in from every direction. The forest was silent in the absolute way that it gets silent when the dominant predator in the ecosystem is present and everything else has stopped moving. The dogman's expression, if expression is even the right word for what a canine face conveys, was not aggressive. It was not fearful. It was not curious in the way that a bear is curious. The blank investigative attention of an animal trying to determine whether something is food or threat. Merle said the dogman looked at him the way a person looks at someone they have not seen in a long time. Recognition, assessment of what has changed and what has stayed the same. A taking of measure that was evaluative and personal and aware. He said the eyes were the hardest part. The eyes told him everything he had spent 20 years trying not to know, that the dogman remembered him, that it knew who he was and what he had done, that the 3 weeks in the garage and the decade in the cage, and the escape and the return and the years of shared territory, and the trap on the rock, and the camera destructions, and the vocalizations in the dark had all been part of something the animal understood as a relationship, a specific, individual relationship between itself and the man who had pulled it from the den and then given it away. The dogman held eye contact for what Merle estimated was 5 seconds. Then it did something that he has replayed in his mind thousands of times in the years since. Something that he described to us with a precision that suggested he had worn the words smooth through repetition. It raised its right hand out of the water, slowly, palm facing Merle. The fingers spread apart, the claws visible in the morning light, dark against the pale skin of the palm. It held the hand up for a moment, at roughly chest height, and then it lowered the hand back to its side. Merle does not know what the gesture meant. He has thought about it for almost 20 years, and he does not know. It was not a wave. It was not a threat display. It was not any behavior he has ever seen in any animal, wild or captive, in his entire life. It was a gesture, a deliberate movement of the hand, directed at him, performed with the controlled intention of an intelligence that understood it was communicating, and chose a method of communication that transcended the barrier between their species. Then it turned away, went down onto all fours in the creek, the water surging around its body as it lowered its massive frame and moved upstream in a quadrupedal stride that covered ground so fast the water sprayed on either side like a boat cutting a wake. It was around the bend and gone within seconds. No sound afterward, no vocalization, just the creek running and the ice cracking and Merle standing on the bank with his heart rate somewhere in the 150s and his hands shaking so hard he had to press them against his thighs to make them stop. He walked back to his truck, drove home, walked in the door and told his wife he was done trapping. She looked at him and asked why. He said his knees could not take it anymore. She did not believe him. She had watched him limp through 30 winters on those same knees without quitting, but she did not push, because something in his face told her that whatever was behind the decision was bigger than knees and was not something he was ready to share. Merle pulled all his equipment from the drainage within the week. Traps, sets, stakes, wire, everything that marked his presence on those creek banks. He did not go back. For the first time since he was 14 years old, Merle did not have a trap line in the state forest, south of the Flambeau River. The aftermath of that decision unfolded in the quiet, corrosive way that all profound disruptions unfold in a life organized around routine and identity. Merle had been a trapper for over 30 years. It was not just what he did. It was who he was. His knowledge of the forest, his relationship with the landscape, his standing in the small community of men in Price County who still practiced the trade. All of it was built on the foundation of being someone who went into those woods in the dark and came back with pelts and stories, and the quiet confidence of a man who understood his country better than anyone who had not walked it. He stopped going into the woods. Not immediately, and not completely, but the process was steady, and the direction was clear. He did not hunt that fall. He told Roy he was taking a year off. The year stretched into 2, then 3, Then the idea of going into the forest after dark with a rifle and a headlamp became something that triggered a response in his body that he could not override with willpower. Heart rate elevation, shallow breathing, a vigilance that turned every sound into a potential threat and every shadow into a shape he had seen standing in a creek at dawn looking at him with amber eyes that held 20 years of memory. His marriage strained. His wife could feel the withdrawal even though she could not identify its cause. Merle was home more, but he was less present. He sat on the back porch in the evenings and looked at the tree line to the south, and she knew he was listening for something, though she did not know what. He slept poorly. He checked the locks on the doors more than once a night. He installed motion sensor lights on the garage and the shed, lights that illuminated the yard when a deer or a raccoon moved through, but that Merle checked from the window every time they triggered, looking for something larger, something upright, something with amber eyes reflecting the floodlight from the edge of the yard. He did not tell his wife about the dogman. He could not find the words. How do you tell someone that you pulled a baby dogman out of a den when you were 30 years old and sold it to a man who kept it in a cage for 10 years, and now it is back in the woods behind your house, watching you, and the scar on its shoulder is the same scratch you noticed when you held it in your garage 20 years ago? The sentence sounds insane. The experience behind it is real and verified by physical evidence and corroborated by an independent observer and supported by decades of parallel reports from across the Great Lakes region. And it still sounds insane because the gap between what the evidence supports and what the culture accepts is so wide that no individual can bridge it alone. Roy knew. Roy had seen the tracks. Roy had heard the vocalizations on his own trapline. Roy had examined the tree markings and the track casts, and the trail camera footage and the trap that was placed on the rock. Roy believed Merle because Roy had his own evidence and his own family's traditional knowledge and his own years of observation to draw on. But Roy was one person, and the knowledge that two retired trappers in Price County shared between them over coffee in Roy's kitchen was not going to change anything about how the DNR, or the Forest Service, or the state of Wisconsin understood what lived in the Flambeau River State Forest. The institutional silence around what Merle documented is identical to the pattern that Linda Godfrey described across her 30 years of research, and it operates through the same mechanism in Price County that it operates everywhere else. The Wisconsin DNR's wildlife monitoring system recognizes a fixed list of predator species in the state: gray wolf, black bear, coyote, bobcat, fisher, pine marten. The database has fields for each of these species. Biologists enter observation data, track data, population estimates, and management recommendations into a system designed to process known species according to established protocols. There is no field for unknown bipedal canid. There is no checkbox for territorial markings at heights that exceed the reach of any documented predator. There is no protocol for processing trail camera footage of a 7.5-foot dogman standing in a creek on two legs. Merle spent 36 years working alongside the DNR through his trapping activities. He knew the biologists in the Cadillac district. He respected them. He understood that they were good scientists, operating within a system that was designed to manage the natural world as it was understood, and that the system had no mechanism for accommodating evidence that challenged that understanding. A wildlife biologist who reported observing an unclassified large bipedal predator in the Flambeau River State Forest would not be investigated. They would be evaluated. Their judgment would be questioned. Their future assignments would be affected. The career consequences of filing such a report are not hypothetical. They are understood by everyone in the system, which is why nobody files the report, which is why the system continues to function as if the evidence does not exist. The trap on the rock, which Merle considers the clearest single demonstration of the dogman's intelligence, could never be entered into any wildlife monitoring database, because the database has no category for tool-aware non-human species that communicate through object manipulation. The tree markings, which constitute a territorial signaling system that has been maintained for at least half a century in the same drainage, cannot be processed because the system classifies all tree damage as either bear activity or weather damage, and anything that does not fit either category is discarded. The trail camera footage, which shows a dogman that does not match any species classification in the state of Wisconsin, would be dismissed as a misidentified bear or a hoax because the alternative, accepting the footage at face value, would require creating a new species classification, which would trigger environmental impact assessments, habitat protection reviews, and a bureaucratic cascade that nobody in the system has the authority or the incentive to initiate. The silence is not a conspiracy. It is architecture. The system was built to manage what is known, and what is known does not include what Merle found in that drainage. The system is not lying. It is blind. It cannot see what it was not designed to see, and the people inside it, good people, competent people, scientists who care about wildlife and work long hours for modest pay to protect it, those people protect their careers by not looking at evidence that the system cannot process. It is the most rational behavior in the world. It is also the reason that a population of intelligent, territorial, bipedal canines has been living in the forests of northern Wisconsin for at least half a century, probably much longer, without appearing in a single official wildlife management document. The ethical dimension of Merle's story sits in a different place than the ethical questions raised by other dogman encounters we have covered. In most cases, the ethical tension is between the witness's obligation to share what they have seen and the personal cost of sharing it. Merle's ethical burden is more specific and more personal. He took a young dogman from its family. He sold it into captivity. That action, made without malice and without understanding, set in motion a chain of events that included 10 years of imprisonment for an intelligent being, an escape that could have gone badly for humans or the dogman, a return to territory that had been disrupted by the absence of one of its members, and decades of aftermath that have damaged Merle's health, his marriage, and his relationship with the landscape that defined his identity for the first 50 years of his life. Merle does not use the word guilt when he talks about it. He uses the word responsible. He says he is responsible for what happened to the dogman, and responsible for what the dogman's return has meant for the drainage, and responsible for the fact that nobody in a position of authority knows what is living in those woods, because he, the person with the most comprehensive evidence, will not share it. He carries the responsibility the way the Ojibwe elders' words suggested, as an obligation created by contact, a debt that cannot be repaid because the creditor does not accept the currency of human apology or regret. The dogman did not need Merle to feel guilty. The dogman needed Merle to stop taking things that did not belong to him and to leave the drainage alone. And in 2007, standing on a frozen creek bank watching it raise its hand, Merle finally understood the terms. What Merle has observed over the past 17 years since he stopped trapping is both more and less frightening than what came before. More frightening because the evidence of intelligence has continued to accumulate. Less frightening because the encounters, such as they are, have shifted from surveillance to something closer to coexistence. The dogman, or dogmen, are still in the drainage. The territorial markings are still maintained. Merle drives past the state forest boundary on the county road regularly and occasionally walks the perimeter of the territory he mapped years ago, photographing new markings and noting changes in the boundary lines. The territory has been stable for about 10 years. It has not expanded further toward populated areas. The marked trees form a perimeter of approximately 15 square miles, centered on the same feeder creek and the same moraine ridges where Merle ran his trap lines and where the den under the hemlock root has long since collapsed. Roy died in 2019. Cancer. Merle lost the one person who understood what he carried and who could corroborate what he had seen. Roy's death left Merle as the sole living witness to the entire arc of the story, from the pup in '87 through the decades of evidence that followed. The isolation of that position, being the only person alive who knows what the trap on the rock meant and what the scar on the shoulder proved and what the hand raised from the water was trying to say, is the thing that finally motivated Merle to contact this channel. He said he did not want to die with the story locked inside him, as so many witnesses die with their stories, taking the evidence into the ground because nobody in their lives could hear it without hearing them differently afterward. Roy had handled the knowledge differently than Merle. Roy had his Ojibwe family connections, the fragments of traditional understanding that gave him a framework for accepting what they were finding in the drainage. Where Merle's worldview cracked under the evidence, Roy's bent to accommodate it. Roy continued to trap the east side of the state forest through 2015, nearly 2 decades after the encounters began. He adjusted his routes. He paid attention to the sign. He respected the territorial boundaries. And the encounters he had on his own ground, which he shared with Merle over years of conversations that neither man ever recorded or wrote down, followed the same pattern: observation, proximity, communication, restraint. The dogman on Roy's side of the forest behaved the same way the one on Merle's side behaved: territorial but not aggressive, aware but not hostile, present but unwilling to escalate beyond display and demonstration. Roy told Merle once that the Ojibwe understanding of these beings was simpler and more practical than anything the Western mind would come up with. He said the old people did not ask what the dogman was. They did not try to classify it or study it or understand its biology. They asked what it wanted, and the answer, as far as the traditions were concerned, was the same thing it had always been. It wanted to be left alone on its ground. It wanted humans to recognize the boundary and stay on their side of it. It wanted coexistence on terms that it defined, not on terms that humans imposed. And for centuries, Roy said, that arrangement worked. The Ojibwe respected the territories. They taught their children where not to go. They maintained a relationship with the landscape that included the dogman as a known presence, accounted for and accommodated, the way you accommodate a neighbor whose property you do not cross without permission. The European-descended population that replaced the Ojibwe as the dominant human presence in these forests did not inherit that understanding. The trappers and loggers and settlers who moved into northern Wisconsin in the 19th century had no traditional knowledge to draw on. They did not know what lived in the deep timber. They did not recognize the territorial markings for what they were. They attributed the sounds they heard at night to wolves or wind or their own imagination. And the dogman, faced with a new human population that did not observe the old boundaries, adapted. It became more cautious, more hidden, more deliberate about avoiding contact. The intelligence that had allowed it to maintain a negotiated coexistence with the Ojibwe for centuries was redirected toward evasion, toward remaining invisible in a landscape that was being systematically stripped of cover by the logging companies and reoccupied by people who did not believe it existed. That adaptation is what allowed the dogman to survive the logging era, the settlement era, the era of mechanized forestry, and the era of recreational use that followed. Through every transformation of the landscape, the dogman adjusted. When the old-growth forest was cut, it retreated to the draws and ravines and swamps where the loggers could not economically operate. When the CCC planted the pine rows, it used the uniform plantations as cover, the dense, even-age stands providing concealment that the old mixed forest had provided through complexity. When the state established the Flambeau River State Forest and recreational visitors began arriving by the thousands each summer, the dogman shifted its activity deeper into the interior and concentrated it at night when human presence dropped to near zero. Each generation of change required a new adaptation, and each adaptation required intelligence, not instinct. Intelligence, the ability to observe a changing environment, assess the new threats and opportunities, and modify behavior accordingly, across a timescale measured in decades. Merle's pup was born into that lineage of adaptation. It was part of a population that had been refining its survival strategy for at least a century, probably much longer. And when Merle pulled it from the den, the population lost a member. Not to predation or disease or any of the natural causes that wildlife managers account for in their population models, but to a trapper who did not know what he had found and made the worst possible decision about what to do with it. The pup's absence from the population would have had consequences that Merle can only speculate about. If it was part of a family group, a breeding pair with young, then its removal would have disrupted the group's social structure. The adults would have searched for it. The vocalizations Merle heard through his garage wall on the 14th night may have been an attempt to communicate with adults that were moving through the drainage, looking for their missing young. The call went out. Nobody answered, because nobody was close enough to hear it, or because the adults had already searched the area and moved on, or because the garage walls in the distance attenuated the sound below the threshold that the adults could detect. The pup called, and the forest did not answer, and Merle sold it the next week. 10 years later, when the adult dogman escaped from Lester's cage and returned to the drainage, it was returning to a territory that had been managed in its absence by others of its kind. The territorial markings that predated Merle's discovery by decades, the scars on the trees at the logging camp clearing, proved that the population had maintained its territory through the pup's absence. But the returning individual would have been different from anything the population had encountered before. It had spent a decade in captivity. It had been exposed to human behavior at close range for 10 years. It had learned things about human tools, structures, and patterns that a wild dogman would never have had the opportunity to learn. It had been shaped by captivity in ways that its wild counterparts were not. Merle believes that is why the encounters with the escaped dogman were different from any other reported dogman encounter he has read about or heard described. The typical dogman sighting is brief. A glimpse, a shape on a road, a figure at the edge of a headlight beam. The dogman avoids extended contact with humans because its survival strategy is built around evasion. But Merle's dogman, the one with the scar, did not evade. It engaged. It stood on ridgelines and watched. It removed traps and placed them on rocks. It raised its hand from the water. It came to his house and looked through his window. Every one of those behaviors represented a departure from the normal dogman behavioral profile, and Merle believes the departure is explained by the decade in the cage. The animal learned humans during those 10 years. It learned their tools, their habits, their vulnerabilities, their schedules. It learned that humans are slow, weak, easily confused, and dependent on technology. And it learned that humans can be communicated with, if you are patient enough and clear enough, and willing to repeat the message until the human understands. The cage did not make the dogman dangerous. The cage made the dogman fluent. It gave the animal a vocabulary of human experience that its wild counterparts do not possess, and it used that vocabulary to conduct a 25-year conversation with the man who put it in the cage. A conversation about territory, memory, and the terms under which two intelligent species can share a piece of ground that belongs, in any honest accounting, to the one that was there first. The dogman's intelligence, viewed across the full timeline of Merle's observation, tells a story that goes beyond the behaviors documented in any single encounter. From birth to the present, the dogman has demonstrated a learning curve that rivals or exceeds the most intelligent non-human animals in the scientific literature. As a pup, at 3 to 4 months of age, it was already demonstrating evaluative attention, studying Merle's face with an intensity that suggested cognitive processing rather than stimulus response. It learned the dimensions and vulnerabilities of its enclosure within days. It studied the latch mechanism on the dog crate. It produced structured vocalizations directed outward, toward the forest, as if calling for members of its species. In captivity, over a decade, it learned human behavior by observation through a chain-link fence. It figured out a lever latch. It climbed interior walls and identified structural weaknesses in its enclosure. It adapted to reinforcements by finding new vulnerabilities. Every improvement Lester made to the cage, the dogman eventually figured out, or would have figured out given enough time. It escaped during a thunderstorm, which suggests it understood that the storm would cover noise and reduce human attention, or it may have exploited structural weakness that the storm created. Either interpretation implies planning. After the escape, it navigated back to its natal territory from at least 20 miles away, across highway corridors and developed land and unfamiliar terrain, to a drainage it had been taken from at 3 months of age. It re-established itself in the territory. It located others of its kind, or was located by them, and formed or rejoined a social group. It identified Merle's trapping operation within months of its return and began monitoring it. It learned his schedule, his routes, his parking locations. It figured out his trail cameras and systematically destroyed them. It removed a trap from a set with the drowning wire intact, carried it to a visible location, and arranged it as a message. It recognized Merle personally, at close range, in full daylight, and responded to his presence not with aggression or flight, but with a deliberate communicative gesture that transcended the behavioral repertoire of any known animal species. That trajectory, pup to captive to escapee to territorial adult to communicator, is a developmental arc that describes something with a capacity for learning, adaptation, and long-term memory that places it alongside the great apes, and possibly beyond. But unlike great apes, which have been studied in the wild and in captivity for over a century, the dogman has no scientific literature, no peer-reviewed papers, No university research programs, no field stations, no graduate students spending years in the forest with notebooks and cameras building behavioral databases. The Dogman has trappers and security guards and retired game wardens and people who drive logging roads at night and come home with stories they cannot tell. It has Merle. What happened in the winter of 2020? The encounter that Merle describes as the one that made him stop checking the drainage entirely is the third strongest piece of evidence in his account, and the one that brought the story closest to his home. In January of that year, on a night of deep cold, Merle woke to the sound of the motion sensor light triggering on his garage. This happened regularly. Deer moved through the yard. Raccoons investigated the garbage cans. Merle had trained himself to check the window and go back to sleep. He checked the window. What he saw in the light was not a deer. A shape was standing at the edge of the illuminated area, partially in shadow, at the corner of his detached garage about 40 feet from the house. Upright, large, the motion sensor light cast a flat white light that reached about 30 feet from the garage wall, and the shape was at the boundary, half lit and half dark. Merle could see the lower body and the torso. The head was above the light line, in shadow, but the reflected glow from the snow on the ground illuminated enough of the face that he could see the outline of the muzzle and the amber eye shine looking back at him through the bedroom window. It was on his property, in his yard, 40 feet from the house where his wife was sleeping. Merle did not move from the window. He stood there, in his underwear, in the cold air leaking through the glass, and looked at the Dogman looking at him. And for the first time in the entire history of his encounters, he felt the boundary between the forest and his life dissolve completely. The drainage was 6 miles south. The territorial markings stopped 1.5 miles from the nearest house. He had assumed that the Dogman's territory ended at the marked perimeter, and that his property, his yard, his house, was outside the zone of contact. He was wrong. The Dogman was here, standing in the light by his garage, on the ground where his wife parked her car, on the gravel that his grandchildren played on in the summer, looking at him through the glass with the same evaluative attention it had directed at him from a ridgeline in '98 and from a creek bed in 2007. It stood there for what Merle estimates was 30 seconds, long enough for him to see that it was the large one, the 7.5-footer, the one with the scar. Then the light clicked off. Motion sensors have a timer, usually 30 seconds to a minute, and when the Dogman stopped moving, the sensor stopped detecting, and the light went dark. Merle stood at the window in the sudden blackness, his eyes trying to readjust, and he could see nothing in the yard. He did not turn on any lights. He did not open the door. He stood at the window until his feet went numb from the cold floor, and then he went back to bed and lay there until morning with his eyes open, listening to the house sounds and the wind outside, and the absolute absence of any other sound. In the morning, he found tracks in the snow, from the tree line at the south edge of his property, across the yard, to the corner of the garage where the light had triggered, and then back to the tree line. A single set of prints, bipedal canid morphology, 6 inches long. The stride was shorter than what he had measured in the drainage, which he attributed to the Dogman moving slowly, with purpose, through unfamiliar terrain between structures. The tracks went straight to the garage, paused there for the duration of the light, and returned to the forest along the same route. A visit, not a hunt, not a territorial expansion, a visit. Merle photographed the tracks. Then he stood in his yard in the January morning with the coffee in his hand growing cold, and looked at the tree line and thought about what it meant that the Dogman had come to his house. It had left its territory, traveled at least 1.5 miles across ground it had never marked, crossed a county road, walked through open fields, and come to the specific property where Merle lived. It knew where he lived. It had known for years, probably, given its demonstrated ability to track his movements and his vehicle and his habits. It had chosen this night, this January, this moment, to come and stand in his yard and look at him through a window. The message, if it was a message, was not threatening. The Dogman had not tried to enter the garage or the house. It had not disturbed anything. It had not vocalized. It had simply come, stood, been seen, and left. Merle thought about the trap on the rock. He thought about the hand raised from the water. He thought about the pattern of communication that the Dogman had been building over the past 22 years. each instance more personal than the last, each one moving closer to the center of Merle's life. First the drainage, then the trap line, then the trap itself, then eye contact in the creek. Now his yard, his house, his window. It was keeping track of him, the way Merle had kept track of the drainage, adding pins to a map, noting changes, monitoring patterns. The animal was maintaining its own record of Merle. And the visits, the appearances, the displays, were not random encounters with a wild animal. They were deliberate contacts, timed and located to deliver information. I am here. I see you. I know where you live. I remember. Merle has not been back to the drainage since that January night. He does not walk his property after dark. He keeps the motion sensor lights on, and he checks them when they trigger, standing at the window in the cold, looking for a shape at the edge of the light. He has not seen the dogman in his yard again, but he checks every night, because the dogman taught him, over 22 years of carefully escalated contact, that it operates on timescales that humans do not intuitively understand. It waited 10 years in a cage. It waited months after its escape before making its presence known. It waited 3 years between the first tracks and the trap on the rock. It waited 6 years between the trap and the creek encounter. It waited 13 years between the creek encounter and the yard visit. Each interval was longer than the last, and each contact was more personal. The dogman is patient in a way that Merle associates with a being that does not experience time the way humans do, something that measures its life in decades rather than years, and calibrates its actions across timescales that make human planning look impulsive. Merle is 68 years old. He still lives in the same house in Price County. He still drives past the state forest boundary on the county road. He can see the tree line to the south from his back porch, the same line of hardwoods and hemlock and cedar that marks the beginning of the terrain that slopes down toward the drainage and the creeks and the ridges and the land that the dogman has claimed and that Merle no longer enters. His wife knows something happened in the woods, but she does not know what, and Merle is not sure he will ever tell her. The knowledge would not help her. It would only give her the same thing it has given him, a permanent alteration in her understanding of the world that would make the dark outside her windows feel different for the rest of her life. The question Merle comes back to, the one he raised at the end of our last conversation and the one that I have been unable to answer, is whether what he did in 1987 can be undone. He took a young dogman from its den. He sold it. It spent 10 years in a cage. It came back. It found him. It has been communicating with him for over 2 decades, in a language he is still learning to read. And the scar on its shoulder, the mark that identifies it as the specific individual he pulled from a hole in the ground when it was 3 months old, is still there, permanent, carried on its body the way Merle carries the memory of that November morning in the garage, when a pup that was not a wolf looked at him through the wire of a dog crate with eyes that understood more than he wanted to accept. The dogman has never hurt him. In over 25 years of shared territory, of proximity that has included close-range encounters and home visits, and the systematic destruction of surveillance equipment, the dogman has never once acted aggressively toward Merle. It has communicated, it has demonstrated, it has made its presence known in ways that leave no doubt about its capabilities. But it has never harmed him. It has never threatened his wife. It has never damaged his property beyond the trail cameras, which were placed in the dogman's territory and which the dogman had every right, in its own territorial logic, to remove. Merle believes the restraint is the point. He believes the dogman could have hurt him at any time, in any of the dozens of encounters over 2.5 decades where it was closer and stronger and faster and operating in terrain it knew better than he did. And it chose not to. Every time. It chose communication over violence. It chose to stand on a ridgeline and watch, to place a trap on a rock, to raise a hand from the water, to stand in the light by a garage and look through a window. Each act was a message delivered in the only medium available to a being whose intelligence exceeds its ability to speak in human language, and each message carried the same essential content. I am here. I know you. We have a history. This is how I choose to handle it. The forgiveness, if that is what it is harder for Merle to accept than the anger would have been. He said he could understand if the dogman hated him. He could process hostility. What he cannot process is the ongoing, deliberate, patient engagement of something he wronged decades ago. Something that has every reason to want him gone, and has instead chosen to maintain contact, to keep showing up, to keep reminding him that it remembers, and that it is still deciding what the memory means. The evidence sits in Merle's house. Track casts, photographs, trail camera footage, a topographic map with 214 pins in it, spanning the territory from the original den site to the perimeter of marked trees to the location of the yard visit in January of 2020. 11 years of field notes written in the same careful hand he used for his trapping records. Everything a biologist would need to begin an investigation, if a biologist were willing to investigate a species that does not officially exist. The drainage is still there. 6 miles south of the Flambeau River, in the state forest, in terrain that rolls and dips and hides itself behind moraine ridges covered in hardwoods and hemlock and cedar swamp. The feeder creek still runs through the draw where Merle found the den. The beaver dams are still there, rebuilt and maintained by colonies that share the water with something they cannot outswim and cannot outthink, and have learned, in as prey species learn, to tolerate, because the alternative is worse. The marked trees still stand along the perimeter, the older ones bearing scars that have healed into thick ridges of bark, the newer ones showing fresh gouges that weep resin into the winter air. Something moves through that drainage in the dark, something with amber eyes and a canine skull and hands that can grip wire and disassemble traps and raise a palm in a gesture that means something Merle is still trying to understand. Something that was born in a den under a hemlock root in the fall of 1987 and spent the first 3 months of its life in a shallow scrape in the hillside before a man reached in and pulled it out and set in motion a sequence of events that neither of them can undo. Merle asked us not to reveal the specific location of the drainage within the state forest. He asked us not to describe the access routes or the landmarks that would allow someone to find the den site or the marked trees or the creek stretches where the tracks are most consistently found. He asked this for the same reason that every witness in this field eventually arrives at. The dogmen are there because nobody knows they are there. The anonymity is the protection. The day someone drives a truck down a logging road with a rifle and a thermal scope and goes looking for proof, the delicate arrangement that has allowed a population of dogman to exist in a 90,000-acre state forest within driving distance of a town of 1,500 people collapses, and what follows, the hunting, the media, the institutional panic, the bureaucratic response that would be too late and too blunt and too human to protect a presence that was here before the logging, and before the towns, and before the highways, and before any of us. What follows would be the second worst thing Merle ever did to them. The first was pulling a pup from a den. The second would be telling the wrong person where to find the den. The Flambeau River State Forest covers over 90,000 acres of northern hardwoods and conifer swamp and glacial moraine in Sawyer, Price, and Rusk counties. The South Fork of the Flambeau River runs through it for 75 miles. And the tributary creeks that feed the river drain a landscape that has been growing back from the logging era for over 100 years. It is dense, it is remote, and in the interior, away from the river corridors and the maintained trails, it sees almost nobody. Merle knows this forest, the way the men who trapped it before him knew it. By feel, by the sound of water and wind, and the animals that live in the draws, and on the ridges, and along the creek banks where the sand is soft enough to hold a track. He spent 30 years walking those trails in the dark, reading sign, understanding patterns, learning the language of a landscape that most people experience only from the seat of a canoe on a summer afternoon. He earned the forest how a person earns anything, through time and attention and the willingness to be changed by what he found. What he found changed him. A pup in a den, a scar on a shoulder, a hand raised from the water, a shape at the edge of a light. The knowledge that the forest he loved and worked and thought he understood was home to a being that understood him better than he understood it, and that had chosen, across 25 years of contact, to let him live alongside it on terms he is still learning. The dogmen are in the drainage. They will be there after Merle is gone. They will be there after the forest grows and falls and grows again, after the beaver dams wash out and rebuild and wash out once more, after the hemlock roots collapse and the cedar swamps fill with silt, and the moraines are ground down another inch by 10,000 more years of frost and rain, and the slow, patient work of gravity. They were here before the Ojibwe gave the river its name. They were here before the French traded for the furs that came from these creeks. They were here before the logging companies stripped the timber and the CCC replanted the pines, and the state drew a boundary around 90,000 acres and called it a state forest. And somewhere in that forest, in a drainage that Merle walked for 30 years and will not walk again, the dogman with the scar on its left shoulder still moves through the dark on trails that are older than any road, along water that has been flowing since the glaciers melted, under a canopy that grows thicker every year as the forest reclaims what was taken from it. It remembers a den under a hemlock root. It remembers hands that reached in and pulled it out. It remembers a wire crate and a chain link cage and a highway it could hear but never see, and 10 years of watching humans walk past it on the other side of a fence. It remembers escape. It remembers the forest. It remembers the man. And it has decided, for reasons that Merle cannot access and that no human framework can fully explain, that memory is enough, that the accounting between them is settled by presence rather than violence, that the hand raised from the water is the final word in a conversation that began in 1987 in a garage in Price County, Wisconsin, and that will not end until one of them is gone from this ground for good. Merle checks the motion sensor lights every night. The yard is empty. The tree line is dark. The forest holds what it has always held. And somewhere south of the river, in country that was old before anyone put a name to it, something with amber eyes and a scar on its shoulder stands in the dark and listens to the silence and decides, again, to let the night pass without incident. Again, the way it has decided every night for 25 years, the way it will decide tomorrow night, and the night after that, and every night until the forest closes over the last of Merle's footprints, and the drainage forgets that any of this ever happened, and the only record that remains is the scar tissue on a shoulder, and the marks on the trees, and the memory of a life that was taken, and what came back and what, against every expectation, chose not to make the man who started it all pay the price that his own guilt tells him he deserves.